In this video, we're going to cover problems that can be represented by rows and columns, or that can be described in terms of rows and columns. So for example, if we wanted to print a grid of asterisk symbols, and we wanted that grid to contain 5 rows and 10 columns. So we wanted the grid of asterisk symbols when it appears on the screen to be 5 asterisks down and 10 asterisk symbols across. So we can represent that problem using the idea of rows and columns. And when we have problems that can be represented by the idea of rows and columns, we can very easily use a loop within a loop, or a nested loop, to solve that problem. So when we're printing the grid, we're going to use a for loop, and the first for loop is going to control the amount of rows that we're going to print, and then inside that for loop we're going to have another for loop, and that for loop will represent or control the amount of columns that we're going to print. So the first thing that we're going to do is just write the first for loop, the outer for loop, that's going to control the amount of rows that we're going to print. So the first thing to do is to write a for loop. So how many rows do we need? Well, we need 5 rows. So I'm going to write a for loop. So that's going to be 4, and I'm going to use the variable j here as my loop counter variable, and I'm going to set j equal to 1 at the beginning for an initial value, and then I'm going to set j less than or equal to 5 because I want 5 rows. Okay, so in order to make progress, we're going to just increment j, and I'm going to have my for loop that looks like that. So it has j as its loop counter variable set to 1, and then we have j less than or equal to 5 as the guard, and j becomes equal to j plus 1 to make progress. So it's just a standard for loop. And what we want to do is we want to print an asterisk. Okay, so just for the hell of it, just to see what will happen, I'll just put in system.out.print, and I'll do a println, and I'll print an asterisk symbol. Okay, so let's compile and run that. Okay, so as we can see in our output window down here, that's just printed 5 asterisk symbols down vertically. So it prints 1, and then a new line, and then another one, and another one, and another one. So it prints 5 of them down. So that's kind of what we want, but we want to print a grid. So for every one of those asterisk symbols, we actually want to print 10. We want to print 10 across, and then another 10 across, and then another 10 across. So rather than just printing 1, we want to print 10 for each row. So what I'm going to do is take this system out, and instead of just printing a single asterisk, I want to print 10. And I'm going to use a loop to do that. So I'm going to use an inner loop. So we could put a little comment in here, and I could call this my, let's get our indentation right first. I'm going to call this my outer loop. And that's going to control the rows, the amount of rows that we're going to print. And the inner loop, call this inner loop, this is going to control the amount of columns. So I'm going to use another loop on the inside here, and this time I'm going to use a different loop counter variable. I'm going to say int I, and int I is going to equal 1 initially, and then I'll say I less than or equal to. So how many columns do I need to print? Well, I need to print 10, so it's going to be I less than or equal to 10. And then to increment I, or to make progress on this one, in this inner loop, I'll say I equals I plus 1. Of course, you could use I plus plus, but I'm just filling it out here in a longer way of incrementing I, just to be absolutely clear. And then in this loop, well, what do I want to do in this loop? I want to print 10 asterisk symbols across for every row. So I'm just going to do a system.out, dot print. Now I've got to be careful here because I want to print 10 asterisk symbols, all one after the other. And then it's only at the end that I want to actually print a new line. So what I'll do is in the inner loop, in this loop, I'm going to just use a print statement, not a print ln, just a print. And I'm going to print the asterisk symbol. Okay, well, why don't we just see what that gives us first of all, before we go any further, before we write any more code. So you'll see that I've got an outer loop, and that's controlling the amount of rows. And then instead of printing a single asterisk on the inside of this loop, I've got another loop. I've got an inner loop, and that inner loop is going to control the amount of columns. I want to print 10 columns. Now, we're not quite finished yet, but as I said, let's just run this and see what happens. Okay, so as you can see from the output, it's not quite what we want. Okay, we're just getting a whole load of asterisks all in one line. Okay, so how do we fix that? Well, the inner loop is printing 10 asterisk symbols. So what do we want to do after I've finished that inner loop? Well, when that inner loop finishes, I actually want to print a new line. So outside of the inner loop, but still inside the outer loop, I'm going to put in a system.out.println. Don't need to put anything in the brackets. I just want to use the println to print a new line. So effectively what's going to happen here is I'm going to print the inner loop is going to do its job and print 10 asterisk symbols. And then when it's finished, it's going to we're going to print a new line. And this inner piece in here, how many times will that be repeated? Well, that will be repeated 5 times because it's the outer loop that's controlling the amount of rows. So this inner block of code, including the inner loop and the println, will be repeated 5 times, and we should now get our grid of asterisk symbols. So let's have a look and see. And there we go. We get our grid of asterisk symbols. There is 10 asterisk symbols across and 5 asterisk symbols down. And we've achieved this by using a loop within a loop. So the outer loop controls the rows, and the inner loop controls the amount of columns or the amount of asterisks across that we're going to print. And of course, this inner block of code is repeated 5 times for the amount of rows that we want to print.